So yeah, I'm a partner at a law firm, Kroll and Mooring. I manage a cyber practice where we focus on helping companies when they've been hacked. We help them develop compliance programs and some response plans, and then we help them with the litigation and represent them when they go through like Operation Cleaver and they have 4.5 million healthcare records get stolen and they're facing consolidated 17 class action cases. And I've been involved in about 800 incidents. I started a cyber practice about 11 years ago. But what's probably more interesting to this group is I spent I have a master's in geophysics. My background's in encryption analytics. And I worked at MITRE for 7 years, involved in red teams. And I worked at DHS for 5 years as well. So I still consider myself an InfoSec person, even though I'm functioning as a lawyer. I'm an InfoSec lawyer. So I do spend a lot of time with startups, and I still spend most of my time looking at code and incidents, and so I am a lawyer, but a different kind of lawyer, I guess, than many of you hopefully look at. And hopefully, since I teach at a law school, there'll be a generation of lawyers behind me that have this background, because we need a lot more, and that's why I teach, because we need just as much of what there's many things I heard yesterday that made me cringe because they're InfoSec people talking about legal principles. I'm sure you would cringe when you hear an InfoSec person a lawyer talking about how we run an investigation.
And one of your students is currently who now?
Chris Krebs, undersecretary, or I guess he's an undersecretary, Chris Krebs, who runs CISA and Cybersecurity Information, Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, the new 8th operational component of the Department of Homeland Security. Lastly, my last disclaimer is, since I am a partner in a law firm and I represent many companies, nothing I'm about to tell you constitutes legal advice. If it does, give me, a portion of a Bitcoin or a dollar afterwards. And please don't ask questions about individual companies, because there may be a chance I may or may not have a relationship with them. So we will be agnostic about actual companies in this presentation. So I guess, should I start off? Yeah. So this really started with a conversation a few of us have been having over time, the four of us and a group of other people, about how we got here. And I still think of the world as as someone who studied numerical models. So for me, it's all about boundary equations, because life is just a set of boundary equations we haven't solved yet or modeled. And so do you want to maybe go to the next? So before we get to this slide, which I'll let, even though my son just finished Breath of the Wild, is really this concept of how do we evolve? What is the current state of governance in terms of how industry, government, and the security research community, we really differentiate those three communities, because industry has a set of rules, mostly laws, some business rules, things like shareholder interests. Some of them are actual regulations, some of them are global norms. And that they live by. Government obviously also has their own set of rules and norms, and that they must live by. And I'm separating out as sort of a member of and a lawyer to the research community, that you have your own set of norms, and some of them actually, since I'm not going to ask how many people violated Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, maybe this morning or maybe last week, because I don't want to know that, and you don't want to know that, put your hand down. But there you have your own set of norms, and you actually work across, in some ways, more efficiently and effectively across government and industry norms than others. So, and my last point before I maybe turn the mic over to some other people is, we really are, so the concept of what we're talking about is, if we think about where we are today with our collective defense and response, and that's the theme of this, is sort of how do we work together across those three buckets of industry, government, and the research community. How do we work together more efficiently where we are now, what we want in our future state, and let's start sort of building it now and thinking about it now. And then what are we going to do when we're sort of at our third time step, if sort of T1, T0, T1, T2, or the 3 time steps, where are we at T2 when we're at war and we need to have, or at some sort of conflict, and that could be at a global level, at a national level, or even at an industrial level. And what do we need to do then? Because I would argue, and I think a premise that we all agree with is, we are not optimally organized to efficiently work across these boundaries. In fact, the boundaries are air-gapped and inefficient. So
I'd actually like to go back to the introductions, because I think it's still worthwhile. Yeah, my humor is, of course, still going to show up. But yeah, no, back here. So Evan introduced themselves, but I also know that there's a few new folks in the room. And so I think it's important, like each of the four of us also represent different elements also back through past experience as well as present of each of those three categories. So, Amy.
Yeah, so for anyone who missed yesterday, so I represent the World Economic Forum, and the main objective of what we're trying to do at the moment is just this, which is bring together public, private, not-for-profit academics to kind of try and make some progress in this area. So I only joined this conversation at lunchtime, but it's really, chiming exactly with the kind of thinking that we've been doing. So really excited to be part of the conversation.
So that's only half true. If you remember, I kind of ambushed you last night at the bar, and I was like, me and that crazy guy over there, we've been talking. We'll come back to you when we have something. So you've actually, but then she really did get the fire hose today as we sat and put these slides together, literally right before lunch and at lunch. Who you are and why.
I'm in the business of solving hard problems. This is like a really hard problem. And if we can make even a dent in this, our time will be well worth it.
Sure. All right, and I'm Bryson. I have a background in military, government, industry, and then I'm also co-founded a nonprofit called the Industrial Control System Village, which is an example of essentially self-organizing at the researcher level. Evan Wolff is our pro bono counsel. Was that full disclosure? You're willing to acknowledge that part of the presentation? And so one of the things we talked about is, if you think about the purpose of the philosophy track, is we're trying to tackle bigger problems, but there's also this kind of practitioner level of a lot of this discussion, and it's really framed in a larger ecosystem, both at a global perspective. You already covered this. Keep going. Right, so this is Sounil's slide yesterday from the half of the sabermetrics, but fundamentally, right, these are the players. This is who we're talking about that are the major players on the stage that are influencing this for better or for worse. This is the part where he disappears. All right, so I thought this was important to put on here because this is a current example of what I would call essentially a market failure in that ecosystem. We have governmental actions happening, and of course, some of those are seen as results that affect private industry. Well, one of the solutions that private industry has to trying to solve that is insurance. And for those of you who are not aware, there is an issue where NotPetya happened, companies were affected, and then they made claims on their insurance. Well, one of those insurance companies said, no, we're not going to pay the claim because that's an example of war. And traditionally, insurance hasn't covered war. The reason I'm highlighting this is not to pick on this particular case or this particular companies at all, but more highlighting again that this is an example where we're already seeing essentially what's a market failure from the fact that this ecosystem hasn't been defined and those boundaries are there. Quick, skip the slide. All right. So I was in China a few months ago, and it's interesting because this idea of a collective defense that we're talking about here actually already exists. And one of the interesting things that I saw in China is if you were to go to, I'll just pull it anecdotally, was there was a company and they were presenting, this was the Conference on Internet Freedom and Security, and it was primarily represented by China and the Russians. So, have a sense of humor because I sure as hell had to, and there were some really uncomfortable moments for me there. No, they did not include North Korea. There were no North Korean representatives. But one of the Chinese companies talked about their perspective on how they defend their enterprise. And the starting point for the defense was the Great Wall, the firewall, right? What the government inherently provides as a part of the country, they consider that an organic part of their private defense.
And just quickly, I just wanted to sort of give some historic perspective because, and not to make everyone have a narcoleptic moment, but if we look back to the 1930s and 40s with some legislation, the National War Act and the Defense Production Act of 1950, the government has shown that for national security purposes, we can come together and work across industry. I mean, for example, we couldn't win World War II if we couldn't produce planes in a really efficient manner. It was taking weeks and months to produce B-52 bombers. We decided that we were going to sort of allow industry, both across metal companies and manufacturing companies and transportation companies and defense companies, come together in a voluntary way, deal with some of the regulatory issues, antitrust, anti-trade regulations, in a different, look at it from a different lens, and all of a sudden we could build planes in days, not weeks and months. And so when we want to come together as within the U.S., and there's other national examples, UK has a similar set of laws, we can surge and come together and deal with the sort of regulatory boundaries and the sort of legal constraints. But we don't practice that on a regular basis, and we're really good, as we saw since I was a part of the stand-up of the Department of Homeland Security, we're good at doing this in an exigent circumstance. We are less good at doing this on sort of the day-to-day to plan for those exigent circumstances. And that's sort of this collective defense and response is how can we sort of think about, you know, what we need to do now in advance of what it is that, you know, where we need to be.
And the anecdote I give is that a lot of times when I meet with vendors, I pose a question. So if we were in a war, okay, and I had Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics, and one of the vendors came up to me and said, hey, I just stole market share from my competitor in selling bullets. I would be annoyed at them because I would say, look, we're in a war. We can use as many bullets as possible. There is no cap on the market share. So just produce as many bullets as you can. Now, if you can come up with a ray gun, sure, I'll buy a ray gun from you too. But don't argue, don't boast on market share when we're in a war. And so I hear many times with many vendors, security vendors, hey, I just stole market share from blah, blah, blah. That's why you should buy me. And I tell them, hey, are we in a cyber war or not?
Yeah. And I think, so we had a really interesting debate over lunch because initially this was going to be called collective defense, I think. And I kind of said, well, it's about defense, but it's also about response. And it's kind of about, yes, building in that collaboration in defense, but also so that when it comes to response, the relationships are already there and in place. So it's about kind of building that collaboration, crossing those boundaries on both sides, so before and after.
So I think the next slide sort of looks at where we are right now. And once again, since the slides have evolved over lunch, let's, wherever you see collective defense, just put end response in there, at least in your mind. Or if someone wants to replace that. But where we are right now, if you look across the three buckets, how I would describe sort of, you know, from a pure boundary mathematics perspective, I would describe them as sort of we have these very deep boundaries that don't have any real interactions with each other, except for, you know, what I'll call as faith-based initiatives like information sharing, which is our main way of government and industry working together, or through regulations when there is, for example, in the defense sector, under the new safeguarding rule, industry is required to report breaches to the DIBnet, which is a component of the Department of Defense. And similarly for the financial services sector, there's reporting obligations. And through the subpoena process, through Article 3 subpoenas, companies, as we saw recently with the indictment of the APT-10 actors, companies get subpoenaed and they have to respond and provide information to the government. But that's sort of, you know, what I'll call sort of a brittle set of interactions because, you know, it's not voluntary, it's not free-flowing. And really we still have sort of this, you know, pretty clear bifurcation of who's defending networks and who's responsible for sort of offense and sort of defense at another level between industry and government. And once again, the research community is, you know, is sort of, you know, interjected along the way. And almost I would, as sort of a defender of all most internet researchers and security researchers, except ones that do things I can't agree with, you know, you sort of are stuck in the middle because sometimes you have to follow the rules of the road, sometimes you have contractual obligations, sometimes you're held to things like CFAA, and sometimes you're not. And that really, as we saw, I think the bug bounty sort of issue is a great example where this puts sort of everyone sort of at a bit of an odd circumstance. And then we get the development of sort of these sort of anonymous and sort of what really are sort of threat problems, and nation state threat problems also sort of challenge this current model where we have these sort of boundaries that are just not efficient and effective. And that's sort of that's how we think of the sort of current environment. I don't know if you guys.
And I mean, just to kind of emphasize the point that this is a kind of complicated enough environment just in the US, but then if you think about it from a kind of global perspective, you know, trying to work out how regulation intersects, contradicts each other quite often at a kind of global level. And when you've got companies, operating across jurisdictions, this is super complicated.
Great point, 'cause even if you think about it, I've been involved in a number of global investigations for incident response, and if you're dealing with Five Eyes, there's no consensus across the Five Eye countries on what is a forensic investigation, what is forensic information, how do we organize sort of IOCs and TTPs. All those things we have to end up sort of defining the rules of engagement each time, and that's just super inefficient and doesn't lead towards sort of better models and actually would reduce the barriers of working together globally. So if that's sort of T0, are there multiple clicks on this one, or is it one? Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, T1, sorry, this is where I should have looked at the slides. We still have the three, we still have these three parties, but the whole point in T1 is that, it's not that we're going to have a big monolith of a box, although the board would be helpful here. But really what we want to have is sort of what I call porous boundaries, because, industry and government are still going to have, very different objectives. We're not saying we're going to do away with SEC or any of the other regulatory or business incentives that industry has, but in the sort of version of the slide deck, when we evolve it with your help, it's really, we have these sort of boundaries between what they're doing, but we have movement going across the boxes, which instead of having these separate boxes where you don't really have any, except for sort of, this, the sort of benign faith-based initiative, information sharing initiative, here we would actually have true movement, because we would be able to understand what are the rules and norms of how industry and government can regularly share information, what do we care about, what we don't care about. Maybe some of that would actually put into statute and laws, things that would make my life a lot easier and your life more comfortable. But eventually there would have that sort of level of interaction.
And to clarify, like, where the discussion is, so T2, which happens after that, is WAR, okay? And I remember we had this conversation. I used to work for this guy, Mike McConnell, and there was a debate that he had with folks from EFF and Schneier, and anyway, the question was, are we in a cyber war? Okay, and I proposed yes. There was a vote. We said yes or no. Then you had a vote afterwards after the debate, and then we saw who won based on who swung the most number of people. Well, yes, we are in a cyber war. That won. And I would make the proposal that we are, but let's suppose that we weren't, okay? And we know that the future is coming where we're going to enter into cyber war. But before that happens, if the current state is this, where things are very discombobulated and bifurcated, what moves us, I hope what doesn't move us is regulation, but if regulation is going to have to move us, well, regulation may enable us to move, but I would, as industry, I prefer not to, right? Sure. So there's going to be a lot of, yes, right. I want market efficiency. I want things that, I want efficient movement towards this. And so part of the question for us as a group, okay, there are going to be things that will move the government. And I think Amy can shape or discuss that part of the thing. What will drive governments to move together to towards the collective defense? What will drive industry to move towards that? Okay, and then several of us represent all three, but I'm going to put us in this last category. What moves us to say, hey, we need to work together to provide a collective defense ourselves as well? Okay, so that's part of the discussion that we're teeing up for you guys to say what allows us to move from current state, knowing that at some future state, if not already now, we're in this state, or we're going to be in this state. And so before we get to that state, how do we establish that collective defense as quickly as possible so that we're ready for cyber war? Part of the questions that we were that probably I'm not sure if it's appropriate for this audience as much as it is. It's an open question, right? At what level do we feel a response as necessary as from a collective group? Okay, so for example, if on the cybercrime side, if I was trying to think of a good example. Like, let's say Well, I'm thinking if no, I'm thinking like if the Bangladesh heist actually stole $1 billion. So well, he can't talk. I can talk about it. But anyway, but for example, in that case, let's say for the Maersk case, where they're more of a collateral damage from a Russian-Ukrainian conflict, okay, at what point does that constitute us needing to act towards a collective defense, okay? For cybercrime, at what point does the theft of something trigger us to move forward? So in the financial sector, when the SWIFT attacks occurred, or rather not attacks against SWIFT per se, but attacks through SWIFT, there was a collective action that moved forward. And there was a lot of activity. If anyone's in the financial sector, they know that there was a whole bunch of discussion around that. And that was triggered just by $80 million moving, okay? Just by. Now, if $1 billion moved, and Bangladesh failed as a country as a result, okay, what other thresholds would have been triggered? So part of the first question is like, what are the thresholds that we envision will cause us as a research community, cause us as industry, cause us as governments to move towards saying we need to provide for the common defense?
The scenario you just described is also going to be addressed at the operational level. So as you know, when the SWIFT heist started to happen, the question was not how do we protect it from a security perspective, but operationally, what do we need to do? What do we need to do to stay in business should something happen, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all very low level, you know, people talking about, okay, could we close the books this way or that way? Not unlike, you know, the Housestead seizure years and years ago. Okay, that happened, how do we keep going? So if it gets that, my point is if it gets that big, the security researchers are irrelevant, it becomes an operational discussion. Because in the short term, that's what you care about. And so I'm sure when you say, well, if this happens, then what is our minimum survivable operational process? That's sort of what it becomes the most important thing for people.
Yeah, I think for me there's something in this which has come up quite a lot over the last couple of days around incentives and alignment of incentives. So just kind of off the top of my head, I think there's something around incentives in cybercrime that are more likely to be aligned between all the kind of key players of government, industry, and research. But then with cyber war, it's more likely to just be the kind of government interest and, you know, setting the kind of frameworks, and the rest is kind of subservient or, you know, irrelevant. Yeah.
Okay, my take on those questions is from experience, because I was doing something like that, as you might recall from my morning talk. And my take is that its only way to do that is to force entities by law, because I spent 2 years building voluntary cooperation framework for this kind of cooperation, and this simply doesn't work. No part of all. Everybody will give you a lip service, but nobody will spend any money on that and do anything.
So I'm gonna go by rows. Since you sat one row back, you go second, buddy.
So I really think what is cybercrime versus what is cyber war is really distracted us for years and years from really what's at stake here. Because I just see the need for the governments of the world to decide to act collectively against what one of my colleagues on my team called years ago cyber badness. If it's hurting economies, it's hurting people, they need to work together to stop it. And whether we trigger war rules and whether it's conflict or war, it's bad stuff that's happening. And you can do a whole lot of stuff before you meet anybody's definition of war that's really causing harm. And in just about all the cases, it is crime, right? And if we're somehow going to say, well, look, crime's not as important as war, that doesn't, to me, we'll just go a long, long way down this road without doing the coordination we need to stop the crime happening. Cybercrime isn't actually good for Russia to do long term. Having and tolerating crime happening is just not good for any society, whether it's murdering people, burglaring, stealing things, or stealing information and misusing information. And so if we don't cut down on crime and say, okay, crime is itself a bad enough thing that we should get together globally and stop it, whether it breaks into war to me somehow seems like a distraction. But I might be wrong.
So, Westrone, are we still saying names? Am I the only one saying names?
Oh, sorry, Stephen.
I'm not just trying to promote myself. I just want to be clear. Okay, so what you have is a symptom of the foundational problem of we have a global economy built on top of a bunch of regional governments, right? And what you're proposing is that we need to look at this as war. So who's at war is my first question, right? So who's at war, right? Are we saying a specific government is being attacked and they're at war? Are we saying that the allies, right? We're at war. Like, so who's at war?
Transnational entities who are not necessarily a country, and the rules of war really don't have much, traditional rules of war don't have much definition. Right, so if I'm a transnational crime conglomerate stealing money from different countries, where's that fit into war?
So, real just quick point on this one, Todd. When I think of like cybercrime, I think of not nation states going after individual companies, but anybody going after companies' assets, right? Whatever that might be. When I think of cyber war, I think of like denial of service, attack on like critical infrastructure, or basically things that cause a denial of operational capacity to either civil or like military or industrial like areas, right? So like that's the kind of like the delineator for me, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
So I don't think we want to necessarily define what a cyber war, because that's, so to speak, above our, it's above our pay grade, and I don't think we're going to necessarily settle that here. What I think the point of the conversation is, if you were to just assume whatever that state is, we've reached that state. Before we get there, what are the things that we would want to do to remove those boundaries that allow for us to have a common defense? That's essentially what is the posed question. Yes, that's right. Yes. Well, so the easiest group is us as this third category. We'll put ourselves in the researcher category for a moment, okay? So okay, let's abstract the discussion for a moment. Let's just suppose it's us in this room that's on the same side. Okay, amongst us. So really, again, we're trying to drive the discussion in a way that's meaningful and that we can actually capture. So if it's us as a group, what can we, us, do to remove those boundaries? And at different levels, what can governments that are working together, what can they do? What can industry, financial sector, whatever sector, what can they do? All right, so there's a ton of hands, which is great. We want this kind of dialogue. I'm going to start with Earl first because he is in a row that's closer than.
So I wore my Homeland Security jacket, not intentionally because it was cold in here, so I do not speak for Homeland Security. I just used to work there. But let's skip the whole war conversation for a minute because this has actually been done quite a bit, and I threw some links up on Slack. Let's go specifically to, as researchers in this room, what is it that we could do? So the concept of cybersecurity norms and how to operate geopolitically among nations has been going on for a while. I mean, historically, I'd kind of like to toss it back to the panel. You can go all the way back to Law of the Seas, or earlier, but we have not made the progress that we need to. I posted one article actually written by an interpretation from China in English back in 2011, all the way up to about 4 days ago, Carnegie Endowment for the Peace, talking about how we've tried to have progression and elements in this conversation among nations, because the reality is the only people that want a level playing field are the ones that are not the ones on top. And otherwise, there are different elements as to what is fairness and what is a norm based off of your geopolitical elements of the particular nation where you are. And not to fall back into the elements of intellectual property theft, there's a component of all of that that starts to bring us down that road when we're dealing with economic competitiveness, and we're already going to go into 2020 conversation. Things are very fast moving and dynamic. I'm talking to the election here, 2020. These are all elements that play together. So the question, though, is what could we do, to Sounil's point, to kind of circle it, as a security research community to try to encourage an open conversation about some establishment of norms, continuation of norms? Are there things that could be promoted by organizations, by individuals, by companies to put forward some of those norms, and realizing each one always comes with the context of the people that are saying it. So how we can keep driving that forward is something that I think there's a lot of conversation through, some of it up on Slack, but I love that you bring in the point of an economic values, and it's an economic conversation, because really that's what's driving this is economics, as we are trying to figure out the different levers and elements that we pull.
Thank you. Well said.
Hi, I'm David. So my perspective would be from industry, and in taking, I think, existing models that are out there around various advisory boards, I think one approach would be to have companies establish security advisory boards that are made up of peer CISOs. So you can have the visibility, and it's really about that radical transparency, right, in terms of, if you want to quote Ray Dalio, of what a company needs to do. I think the greatest challenge that we face on the industry side is one that Will had mentioned earlier. There's such a long period for customer education around what are the new vectors and techniques that we have to address. Half the time we're trying to explain, oh, wait, the antivirus 1.0 is no longer adequate. Wait a second, that was a conversation we should have had many, many years ago. And if there's so many frameworks that are already out there, it's not a question of, hey, do we have a framework? The question is, how do you apply it to companies based on their maturity and their capability? And so I believe if people are willing to come together from a top-down perspective and say, we are willing to help each other at a peer level, if you want to call it a security advisory board, that's fair, and to help each company and use that as leverage to spread the knowledge and democratize it.
Gotti, and then.
So I actually want to, just because we're raising ideas for things we need to do and how we can do them. So number one, I think that if we talk about international law, we're really out of our league. Not that we can't help, we can, but honestly, international law is being made now. For example, the Obama administration with their executive orders around a MAC address can point to the person that is not an enemy combatant being in the same area. I don't know if you guys know about this. I'm not a lawyer, first of all. Don't trust me on anything that I say about the law. An enemy combatant, if somebody is recruiting, going all the way back to Lincoln, right, is recruiting for the enemy, and we can right now, we can't take them down. They're not an enemy combatant. What do we do? The Obama administration has shown that if their MAC address was in the same location as enemy combatants, they could take them down, as far as I remember. So this is taken care of, and it will happen without us. What I worry about is three things. Number one, how do we affect policy? Because we live in a time that is actually an historical moment. Changing policy takes 15, 20 years. Right now, policy is being made. Now, we won't be able to affect the politics of it, but if it's based on something real that we can help create and bring to policymakers, which is very hard to do, I know, we try all the time, that is a great thing. Two, yes, we can talk about sovereignty, and we can talk about governments, and we can talk about all those things. Honestly, the Tallinn manual, the Tallinn 2 manual is already doing a really horrible job at it. Let them work on it for number 3, okay? What I'm concerned about is, as an organization, if I go and do incident response today, I am breaking the law in many, many cases, okay? If I want to go on the dark web, I am breaking many, many laws. If I want to communicate with an enemy combatant to get my information, I'm breaking many, many, many laws. Is there some sort of guidance to what we can actually do? And lastly, if we talk about laws, right? One thing that I kept missing, and I still miss when I talk to lawyers, is some of our concepts just don't exist yet. For example, if we look at the CFAA, there is no concept of location. If something happens at my organization or it's on the other side of the world, CFAA doesn't care. It doesn't matter if it's forensics, for example. And number two, there is no concept of intent. It doesn't matter if my intent is forensics, intent in law, right? So we have a lot of things to fix, and I think where we should concentrate is, where do we feel the pain? For example, don't go to jail if you do incident response. And how can we actually, collaboration will happen. We always talk about information sharing. Finishing this off from my perspective, if I can get information on what I can do and how I can help and how I can educate the policymakers better than what we've tried before, and how I can solve my legal problems to not go to jail, because I'm a good guy, you know, I'm doing the air quotes thing, then that's what I'm interested in. Thank you.
Reklama, just because, once again, not legal advice, but the whole common law criminal system is based on the concept of mens rea, actus reus, the fact that you have a criminal intent, criminal mind, and a criminal act. And so that is sort of filtered down into every criminal law, I think, in at least in the United States, which I know some about. But I think Gadi's point is spot on, is that the interpretation of what criminal intent means under CFAA is something that is the courts and lawyers are actively debating, and there's, even in some of the breach law cases that we're seeing, there's active splits, there's some great decisions and movement being gone out, but there is this sort of still gap, this big boundary between, what the InfoSec community knows and what the legal community knows, and we're getting better at it, but there's still, we still need better interpretation and versions.
Okay, I'm going to close it with this last one.
Just a couple of points closing, so I won't articulate it as nicely as you do, but to your last point about the legal community knowing this and the InfoSec community knowing this, what can we do in practice? Hell, we can learn. So I'll pick up on, where's Jonathan? Back there. The concept that he talked about in terms of trading zones, right? What can we do in practice? Let's get the security community to learn what the others are doing. Let's learn from the lawyers. Let's learn from the economists, right? That's point number one. But as to what can we do to increase the sharing, and again, I won't articulate it as nicely as Gadi did, but isn't it fundamentally an issue of quote-unquote safe harbor? In other words, people are afraid to collaborate because there's penalty to do so. Let's just recognize that and start, I hate the word just, but let's recognize that and start working on the concept of, okay, how can we do this without consequence or with mitigating circumstances for something, right? I think the idea of the CISO panel, it's great, but how can we guarantee that those individuals won't be penalized either within organizations themselves or by the market or by government? So you want concrete steps? For us, let's learn what's out there beyond the cute packet captures. Let's learn let's do the trading zones that Jonathan talked about, right? And let's provide a better model for safe harbor.
So all right, thank you very much for the comments. One basic question I would ask for ourselves as we go into that discussion later on is whether we make that continue to make that voluntary, or we make that the conversation that we had around near misses last year, one of the core questions was whether we make that voluntary or we make that mandatory. And no one wants to be told, hey, you got to do this. But the near misses, there's an incentive if you actually participate, where you have fewer fines, or if you get fined, you don't pay as much. And so, yes, I'm on an advisory board. It's voluntary, but being on an advisory board or being part of having an advisory board allows me to lower my fines in the event that I'm found negligent or whatever else it might be. Yeah. Okay, so any parting thoughts from Evan, Bryson, or Amy?
Just sort of a quick curveball there to tie this back to the economics. It's really easy to paint this into an us versus them mentality, but consider the fact that, we're talking about the internet, which has allowed economics to grow at this rate and to function this way. And so we have to consider that there is détente here, because at the end of the day, the risk of losing détente is balkanization, which of course defeats the entire purpose to begin with.